Welcome back to Monitors Unboxed. Today I'm checking out another hotly anticipated 32-inch 4K 240Hz QD-OLED gaming monitor, the Gigabyte Aorus FO32U2P. This particular variant has received a ton of attention for being the first to offer DisplayPort 2.1 UHBR20, which I already talked about in a separate video on the channel. Now it's time to take a look at what the rest of this display has to offer. I've already tested a range of 32-inch 4K 240Hz QD-OLEDs from Asus, MSI and Dell, all of which basically use the same panel as the FO32U2P, so from that perspective the Gigabyte model isn't hugely different. The AW3225QF from Dell is curved, while the FO32U2P is flat, so that's a major difference, but the basic stuff like HDR certification, rate of response time performance, and even some features you'll find across all the variants. As we've seen from a lot of OLEDs so far, picking the best one usually comes down to performance tuning, pricing, and additional exclusive features. Speaking of pricing, the FO32U2P is one of the more expensive 4K QD OLEDs with a price of $1,300 US, giving it price parity with the Asus model but coming in above the MSI and Dell variants. Gigabyte are also offering a cheaper version, the FO32U2, which omits DisplayPort 2.1 functionality and is priced $200 less at $1,100 US. So presuming it performs the same as the variant with DisplayPort 2.1 that we're about to test, that's also a product to keep an eye on. The design of the FO32U2P is pretty similar to other 4K QD OLEDs. The front is dominated by the large 32-inch panel with its glossy coating, slim bezels on three sides, along with the strip at the bottom that features the Aorus logo. On the rear, it's a central box design which houses all the main components, then the OLED panel extends outwards, giving the very edges of the display an impressive thin appearance. Gigabyte has chosen to use mostly plastic for the outer surfaces with grey metal legs. There's a few different textures for the box on the rear and generally I think the design looks decent. At the top is an RGB LED strip that includes the Aorus logo and it has this interesting holographic effect, but I'm not sure whether I like it or whether it cheapens the overall look. You're probably not going to see it anyway as it's on the back. The stand uses a typical leg design with the legs sitting flush on your desk. Gigabyte has made a good effort to keep the legs relatively thin so that you can still place items around the base of the monitor, and the overall stand is quite sturdy. It offers height, tilt, swivel and pivot adjustment with an appropriate amount of height at its maximum. The port selection is one of the bigger talking points about the FO32U2P, given it's the first gaming monitor I'm aware of to use the full DisplayPort 2.1 UHBR20 specification, offering 80 gigabits per second of bandwidth. This allows you to use this monitor at 4K 240Hz without DSC. DP 2.1 is offered through two inputs, a full-size port and a mini DP port. There's also two HDMI 2.1 ports at 48 gigabits per second with DSC and a USB-C input offering DP alt mode and 65 watts of power delivery. In addition, we get several other USB ports that can be used as a hub and a DisplayPort 1.4 output port for daisy chaining to another display. My video discussing DisplayPort 2.1 goes into more detail on the inclusion of this port, but basically it has strengths and weaknesses. For most people buying this monitor to use with current generation graphics cards as of mid-2024, you won't actually be using the DP 2.1 functionality right now, instead reverting to use DisplayPort 1.4 at 32 gigabits per second with DSC. This means the normal operating mode of the FO32U2P will be no different to similar monitors that only include DP 1.4, as DisplayPort is backwards compatible. The exception to this is when using it with an AMD Radeon RX 7000 series GPU, which utilizes DisplayPort 2.1 UHBR10 bandwidth at 40 gigabits per second with DSC on this display. The benefit to DisplayPort 2.1 is mostly for potential future-proofing. NVIDIA graphics cards have compatibility issues with some features like DSR when display stream compression is used. In theory, a future NVIDIA GPU supporting DisplayPort 2.1 UHBR20 will not have this limitation, as you could hook it up to the FO32U2P over DP 2.1 and not use DSC. But this is theoretical and we don't know what features future GPUs will support. In all the testing I've ever done, I haven't been able to spot a visual difference between DSC on or off. For this review, I put the FO32U2P beside the Asus PG32U CDM, the Gigabyte model using DP 2.1 without DSC, and the Asus model using DP 1.4 with DSC. I couldn't tell the difference, so in my opinion there's no good reason to specifically buy a DP 2.1 monitor to avoid DSC related visual quality issues because there really aren't any. The downsides to actually using this monitor in its DP 2.1 mode relate to cable quality and length. In this configuration, the bandwidth requirements are much higher than DP 1.4, so lower quality DisplayPort cables are unlikely to work and could cause connection issues and visual artifacts. The same cable that works on a DP 1.4 monitor may not be sufficient for DP 2.1. Also, properly certified DP 2.1 UHBR20 cables are limited to just 1.2 meters long right now, with just a 1 meter cable included in the box. Longer cables are still in the development phase, so this is very much an early adopter situation where you will struggle to find a suitable cable length for now. Also, DisplayPort 2.1 cables are usually more expensive than DP 1.4 cables. My opinion at the moment is that DisplayPort 2.1 is a nice feature to have, but it isn't something I would specifically purchase a monitor for, and I wouldn't pay a significant premium for it. DisplayPort 1.4 with DSC works just fine, and while for many FO32U2P buyers there won't be a major downside to having DP 2.1 functionality, as if there's any issues you can just use it in its DP 1.4 mode, there also won't be any significant advantages. The OSD on this monitor is controlled through a directional toggle and includes lots of features like separate display modes, lots of gaming specific features, crosshairs, shadow boosting, FPS counters, and other information readouts, and a good amount of OLED care features as well that you can configure. It's a fast and easy to navigate interface, which is always nice to see. Obviously, a big talking point with the new 4K QD-OLEDs is text quality. Moving to a 3840 by 2160 resolution at this size equates to 140 ppi, a 27% improvement in pixel density compared to 110 ppi 27-inch class 1440p OLEDs that we had previously. Subpixel structure improvements introduced with 2nd Gen QD-OLED and carried through to this 3rd Gen panel also enhanced the apparent pixel density for text and high contrast edges relative to 1st Gen panels and WOLEDs. I was genuinely quite impressed with the text clarity on this 4K QD-OLED monitor, which offers the same experience as other models using this panel. The slight pink-green fringing you see on 1st Gen QD-OLED ultrawides and to a lesser extent the 2nd Gen variants is a lot less noticeable at this 140 ppi pixel density. As someone that found the fringing issues with initial QD-OLEDs more noticeable than others, I'd say it's almost a non-issue here and not something you'll spot in everyday usage, even when using the panel beside a traditional LCD with an RGB striped subpixel layout. Using it alongside a 32-inch IPS LCD, I thought the text clarity and quality from this QD-OLED was very similar, perhaps not quite as good or identical to the IPS, but good enough to satisfy me, and I think I'm pretty sensitive to this stuff. The text clarity here is good enough that you should be able to use the FO32U2P at a wide variety of scaling factors in Windows. The default is 150%, but I typically use a 32-inch 4K panel at 125%, and that looks great. Even at 100% scaling, text is very readable and doesn't suffer from artifacts that are too annoying. The smaller you go, the harder it is to keep up with LCDs, but I'd still give a tick here for 100% scaling usability. All up, I'd say this 32-inch 4K QD-OLED panel is the first OLED panel I've used to provide text clarity that isn't a downgrade from an equivalent LCD, though recent WOLED 4K panels are also quite good. For panel composition and coding, this is your classic Samsung QD-OLED panel experience, which is to say it's glossy with an anti-reflective surface treatment. While Samsung are calling this a 3rd generation QD-OLED panel, the composition appears identical to 2nd Gen QD-OLED, which itself is a small improvement over 1st Gen QD-OLED. What this means is the panel has the same issues described in previous QD-OLED reviews. In brighter environments where light sources are in front of the display, the panel has a tendency to reflect ambient light, raising blacks to the point where they appear somewhat grey. This impacts one of the key selling points to getting an OLED, which is its deep blacks. They just won't be that rich or deep in brighter conditions, especially relative to some WOLED panels. General reflection handling is decent, so mirror-like reflections aren't too bad, though being a glossy panel there is always going to be some amount of visible defined reflections, which get worse the brighter the conditions are. However, the issues with the coding can be minimized by optimizing the placement of light sources in the room so that lights are behind the display. The darker the environment, such as gaming in a dim or fully dark room, the better this QD-OLED panel looks, and in dim conditions you will typically get a rich, deep OLED black experience. It's really hard to say whether this will be an issue for you, as it can be a case-by-case basis. Personally, I do find it annoying and one of the larger issues with QD-OLED panels, but if you primarily game at night, it's not anywhere near as much of a concern. At the very least, it's something to be aware of. What's also important to be aware of is that OLEDs generally aren't great monitors for desktop usage, productivity apps, and web browsing because they are susceptible to permanent burn-in, and this new 4K QD-OLED is no exception. Anything with static content like toolbars or icons on screen for a long period of time, like you get with most desktop applications, is at risk of burning in. Conversely, dynamic content like gaming or watching videos is at practically no risk of burn-in, so don't worry about this if you're primarily using an OLED for gaming. Even the occasional bit of desktop app usage is fine. It's more 8 hours a day of productivity work that may lead to burn-in, as I've seen from my burn-in testing so far with the MSI variant. I'm not at the stage of seeing significant burn-in, but after around 700 hours of exclusive productivity use in a worst-case scenario, I'm seeing early signs of degradation. We'll have more updates on the channel in the next few months regarding that. As for burn-in warranty, Gigabyte are matching other major manufacturers by offering a 3-year warranty that covers panel burn-in as explicitly stated on Gigabyte's website. This gives buyers some peace of mind for the first 3 years. However, I'd still recommend trying to prevent burn-in and extending the life of your display by using dark mode and setting the monitor to sleep after a few minutes of inactivity. Response time performance is excellent on this 4K QD-OLED monitor, as it is for other OLED displays that we've tested so far. OLED offers lightning fast response times around the 0.3 millisecond mark at its maximum 240Hz refresh rate, and that leads to fantastic motion clarity. OLEDs also maintain the same performance at all refresh rates, so even when testing at 120 or 60Hz, we see similar results in the 0.3 millisecond range. This is a nice benefit for variable refresh rate gamers that results in a single overdrive mode experience. In contrast, many LCDs typically perform worse at lower refresh rates relative to their maximum refresh. The major limiting factor to OLED motion performance right now is the refresh rate itself. As a sample and hold monitor, OLEDs do still have some blur in fast motion scenes, and the level of blur depends on the refresh rate. At 240Hz, clarity is superb, but it's not quite as clear as the fastest OLEDs of today that reach 360 or even 480Hz. And when running the display closer to 60Hz, clarity is reduced simply because the refresh rate is reduced, even though response time performance is basically identical at 240 and 60Hz. Still, having such fast response times gives OLED a noticeable advantage over a slower response time LCD running at the same refresh rate. There is effectively no difference in response time performance between this QD-OLED and other OLED monitors, including WOLED variants. This means motion clarity is identical when the refresh rate is the same. However, OLEDs are much faster than even the fastest LCDs I've tested, and this is true whether we look at the best performance or average performance across the refresh rate range. Not only are OLEDs fast, they also have no overshoot artifacts, which can be an issue with some LCD models. When viewing cumulative deviation results, we can see that OLEDs get much closer to ideal response time behavior, and in most cases offer performance an order of magnitude better in this metric than LCDs. In practice, this leads to around a 1.5 times advantage in real-world clarity at a given refresh rate, so 240Hz QD-OLEDs like the FO32U2P offer a similar experience to 360Hz LCDs. The only displays with clearly superior clarity are LCDs that offer elite backlight strobing, a feature that comes with its own set of limitations like incompatibility with variable refresh rates. Input latency is excellent, offering a sub 0.5 millisecond processing delay in both the SDR and HDR modes. Combined with fast response times and a high refresh rate, this OLED feels very snappy to use and is well suited to competitive multiplayer titles, although the resolution may prevent high levels of performance without upscaling. With that said, the LG 32GS95UE offers dual mode functionality with its 4K WOLED panel, allowing it to run in a 1080p 480Hz configuration. That mode is even better suited to competitive gaming as it's faster, has lower refresh latency, and produces better motion clarity, so that's something to consider if multiplayer gaming is your focus. Power consumption is on the high side when displaying a full white image, although this is to be expected from QD-OLED monitors, where full white is a worst case scenario. The Gigabyte model is really no different from other 32-inch QD-OLEDs in terms of power. Full white power consumption is about 3 times what you'd see from a modern efficient 4K IPS LCD of the same size. Obviously not ideal for productivity work, though typical power consumption varies based on APL, so usage is going to be more in the 40 to 80 watt range most of the time, depending on how much white is on screen. That's still higher than the best LCDs of today, but not as outrageous. Moving now into color performance, the color space these 4K QD-OLED panels provide is the same across all models. The FO32U2P comes in with 99.1% DCI-P3 coverage and 97.4% coverage of Adobe RGB, decent numbers for work in those gamuts. Then for Rec 2020, I saw 79.1% coverage, which again is identical to other QD-OLED monitors using the same panel. This is notably higher than the LG 32GS95UE with its WOLED panel, which only comes in at 71% coverage. Factory calibration with this Gigabyte monitor is average. Grayscale performance could do with some work to improve the color temperature and gamma, but it's not far off accurate. Delta E results here are mediocre. Then for saturation and color checker, Delta E's are high as the monitor does not ship with an sRGB clamp enabled by default in the SDR mode. This means that a lot of SDR content like YouTube videos and web pages will be oversaturated in its factory configuration. Compared to other monitors, the FO32U2P has the least well factory calibrated grayscale results of the 4K OLEDs that I've tested. However, color checker results are pretty similar to other models, with all suffering from the same oversaturation concerns. Where Gigabyte have done well is producing a very well calibrated sRGB mode. Unfortunately, this mode does lock you out of setting adjustments like white balance, but the mode is excellent with very strong grayscale results. It's difficult if not impossible to improve upon this with further calibration. Then when looking at saturation and color checker, we see great gamut clamping to the sRGB color space and a continuation of excellent Delta E results. While Gigabyte has done a magnificent job with their sRGB mode, most other manufacturers have also done quite well. In grayscale performance, the FO32U2P is better than the MSI, Asus and Dell models, but the differences aren't all that substantial. For color checker, again, slightly ahead of the other models, and it's good to confirm performance is great, but this isn't a strong reason to purchase the Gigabyte variant over the others. Gigabyte also provide other modes for color spaces like DisplayPort, which again have strong levels of factory calibration and require little to no tweaking. When you don't activate one of these modes, the entire wide gamut experience is available, and even then I wasn't really able to offer much else in terms of calibration through software. I'd just stick to the built-in modes for SDR use, in particular the sRGB mode. Maximum brightness in the SDR mode is identical to other QD-OLED monitors. There's only a 10 nit difference between the FO32U2P and PG32U-CDM, which is insignificant. Still a relatively low result compared to LCD monitors, but sufficient for most desktop usage. Gigabyte disables any automatic brightness limiter in the SDR mode, so there's no need for a uniform brightness setting, as brightness is always capped to around 235 nits. This prevents annoying behavior where the monitor gets brighter as you resize apps, and I prefer it to work this way. Minimum brightness of 20 nits also provides a good range for people that want to use it in a very dim room. I was very impressed with the viewing angles of this panel. They are very wide, which makes it easy to view the display even at quite extreme angles. It really looks excellent. This also means that there is a large sweet spot for viewing this QD-OLED, and you won't notice issues like the edges being slightly lower contrast or a bit washed out, which can be an issue with some flat LCD panels, particularly VAs. Uniformity was also very good with my unit, nice and uniform viewing full white, and no dirty screen effect viewing dark greys. The Gigabyte Aorus FO32U2P is well suited to HDR from a hardware perspective. OLED panels, including QD-OLED, directly emit light and have individual pixel control, which makes them ideal for displaying HDR content. This feature allows each pixel to independently vary from fully switching off to displaying bright highlights, giving us deep zero-level blacks and per-pixel local dimming. The level of control OLEDs provide minimizes blooming in high contrast scenarios and allows for clean distinction between bright and dark areas that are close together. Compared to LCDs with a multi-zone backlight, OLEDs have far fewer ugly illumination artifacts, which are most noticeable when displaying difficult scenarios like star fields or subtitles, and there are no zone transitions as bright objects move around the display. With per-pixel control as its main advantage, OLEDs are best at displaying high-contrast scenes with rich shadow detail, which is a key aspect to a good HDR presentation. Darker content interspersed with dazzling bright highlights brings out the best in OLED displays, as does HDR content with fast motion. For gamers especially, input latency on most OLEDs is low in the HDR mode. The weakness to the HDR presentation on an OLED is overall brightness. While peak brightness can be high in the best cases, full screen brightness is low, and this limits the punch in bright daytime scenes. LCDs may not have per-pixel control, but zoned backlights can simply get significantly brighter in bright scenes. Depending on what you want out of an HDR monitor, your preference could swing more towards LCDs or more towards OLEDs, but typically speaking, OLEDs are a great choice that deliver a fantastic HDR presentation. The Aorus FO32U2P comes with many HDR configurations, largely controlled through two settings, the HDR picture mode and the APL stabilize setting in the OLED care section. Depending on the combination you choose, you'll get different levels of accuracy and brightness. I think it's worth focusing on 3 of these configs: the HDR mode with APL stabilize on middle, which is the default option, the HDR mode with APL stabilize on high, and the HDR game mode, which sets APL stabilize to high. The default HDR mode with the middle APL setting is equivalent to the true black mode we see from other QD-OLED gaming monitors. It has great EOTF tracking at all window sizes and no auto dimming in high APL scenes. However, overall brightness is capped at around 450 nits, even for low APL content. This is the most accurate mode with the least brightness on offer. Remaining in the HDR mode but switching APL stabilized to high provides an experience equivalent to the Peak 1000 mode on other QD-OLEDs. Brightness now reaches 1000 nits in low APL scenes, and EOTF tracking is decent at 2 and 10% window sizes. However, at higher window sizes, which show performance in brighter scenes, EOTF tracking is much less accurate as the display dims above a certain average screen brightness. Then there's the HDR game mode. This mode is also capable of 1000 nits but is overall much brighter than the previous configuration. At small window sizes, EOTF tracking is bad and very inaccurate, but at larger window sizes and for the brighter portion of the curve, it more closely follows the expected curve and produces okay accuracy. Effectively, this mode tries to straddle the 2 previous modes. It doesn't limit brightness in dimmer scenes, still giving you 1000 nits, but instead raises brightness, making lower APL content around 2 to 4 times brighter than it should be. Meanwhile, brighter content is pretty accurate and isn't dimmed like you see from the Peak 1000 type modes. None of these modes offer the best experience for HDR content. You'll still need to pick and choose what aspects you want to preference. When largely viewing brighter, higher APL scenes, the default HDR mode / true black mode is the best. When largely viewing dimmer, lower APL scenes, the HDR plus high APL stabilized configuration / Peak 1000 mode is best. The HDR game mode is great if you want to view brighter scenes accurately while boosting low APL brightness, but in my opinion, it isn't really a fix for the issues found in the other modes where either brightness is capped or the screen dims in bright scenes. My preference as a general choice, which has been the case for most QD-OLEDs, is the Peak 1000 type configuration, which on this Gigabyte monitor is the HDR mode plus APL stabilized set to high. But I have heard from some of our viewers that they prefer the true black type configuration, or even switching between the two depending on what they are viewing. Ideally, this would be resolved and the best aspects of the 2 main configurations combined into a single, universally good mode. Also, as a quick note, what's described here for the main True Black and Peak 1000 type modes and how they perform also applies to the Asus, MSI and Dell models and other QD-OLEDs. Since reports of dimming in some configurations has come to light, I've improved testing to catch that behavior and talk about it more in reviews, which is reflected here, and it will be as well for future HDR monitor content. In synthetic testing, there's no difference between full screen brightness capabilities across the various modes, which are all in the 250 nit range like other QD-OLEDs. Similarly, all can do 450 nits at 10%, which is in line with other QD-OLEDs. However, at a 2% window size, only the configurations which set the APL stabilized setting to high can reach 1000 nits. The default mode is capped to just 452 nits for the brightest elements. For other monitors, the most accurate mode that offers full panel brightness is being used in the chart. Next up is our new real scene brightness table. Whoa, yeah, lots of stuff here, but basically I wanted to show the results of 8 different real scene tests at once, rather than going through individual charts, which gets a bit tedious. You'll see a geo-mean of the 8 tests, which is the order it's sorted in, and then on the right some mid-APL brightness test results from the display HDR test. What this checks for is dimming in brighter scenes and the degree to which it's being dimmed, preventing a manufacturer from winning brightness results by dimming in other scenarios. There's a few things to work through. Firstly, the default HDR mode does not dim brighter scenes, whereas the HDR mode with the APL stabilized setting on high does dim brighter scenes. The level to which this dimming occurs is similar to other QD-OLEDs, where brightness can be halved at times. This also affects real scene brightness in mid and high APL scenes like video scene 4 and 5, which are much dimmer in the Peak 1000 equivalent mode, but reasonable in the other modes. The HDR game mode does only a little bit of dimming and gets closer to the default HDR mode. The most accurate mode though, the default HDR mode, never gets brighter than about 450 nits in real scenes, which is about half as bright as the peak mode at times. This makes it pretty clear where the advantages lie for each of these modes. Then the HDR game mode, it offers good brightness in brighter scenes and good brightness in dimmer scenes, though in video scene 1, brightness was lower than the peak 1000 type mode. It's also by far the least accurate mode, especially for lower APL content, even though it doesn't dim. The other downside to the FO32U2P is that it incorrectly reports its peak brightness figure as 465 nits to Windows in all modes, even though some modes are capable of 1000 nits peak. This can cause problems for some tools like Nvidia's RTX HDR, and it also meant that in some games, brightness on AMD GPUs specifically was lower than it should be. This could be resolved on AMD GPUs through the EDID fix, which I mentioned in the Asus monitor review, although unlike other HDR monitors with problems on AMD GPUs, it doesn't appear to affect brightness universally, only in some cases. This leads to mixed feelings about the brightness capabilities of this display in real-world test scenes. The HDR game mode provides a better mix of real scene brightness across high and low APL content, but does so in a way that massively elevates brightness in low APL scenes, so I hesitate to recommend it. The other two options are mostly what we've seen from other QD-OLED monitors. Here is an illustration of where the accuracy of each mode lies compared to other monitors. The HDR game mode is a significant outlier, while the default HDR mode is the most accurate configuration. Again, ideally there would be a single mode that does everything well. Finally, we have color volume. I'm moving to the newer ICTCP MDC metric here, which measures absolute color volume in millions of distinguishable colors instead of a volume relative to the display's max brightness. This metric is one that Dolby uses to determine a display's color volume, and of course factors in both white and color luminance. As you can see, most QD-OLED monitors offer around 20 to 21 MDC, which is very high among modern displays, as QD-OLEDs can produce a high peak brightness, a very wide gamut, and high color brightness. WOLEDs aren't as good comparatively, with lower color space coverage and much lower color brightness. What we're left with is total MDC for QD-OLEDs like the FO32U2P, around 34% higher than a WOLED like the LG 32GS95UE. Final section of this review is the Hub Essentials checklist. Part 1 assesses whether Gigabyte have done a good job advertising this monitor, and generally what they list on their website is accurate. I particularly like specifying the DisplayPort spec for each port and the APL for brightness numbers. SDR brightness is right on the border of acceptable, while response time advertising as always isn't all that accurate. Meanwhile, in the feature support matrix, we see Gigabyte doing a number of things well. OLED performs very well for contrast and motion performance, and it's good to see inclusions like USB-C with power delivery, a KVM switch, and DisplayPort 2.1, which allows for use without DSC. On the other hand, some features aren't supported, such as Dolby Vision or an unlocked sRGB mode. Then there's the borderline results. The monitor gets close to but doesn't quite reach 250 nits of SDR brightness, and there are times where OLED flickering is visible, if rare. I also only think the monitor has good EOTF tracking at maximum brightness some of the time, as tracking at high APL isn't good in that mode. The monitor also has issues with HDR performance on AMD GPUs, which might be related to incorrectly reporting its maximum brightness. So I've now tested 4 of the latest 32-inch 4K 240Hz QD-OLED gaming monitors, and honestly all of them, including the Gigabyte Aorus FO32U2P, are pretty great. They're high resolution, offer a fast refresh rate, come with great HDR capabilities, and plenty of other complementary features. I think for prospective buyers, it's going to be very difficult to separate them and choose a specific model. The FO32U2P uses basically the same Samsung Display QD-OLED panel as the MSI 321URX, the Asus PG32U CDM, and the Dell AW3225QF, with the latter being a curved version. This means Gigabyte are offering the same elite response times and motion clarity at 240Hz, the same improved text quality relative to other OLEDs, the same screen coding and composition, as well as very similar HDR performance characteristics. Like I said in earlier reviews, I don't think 4K gaming has looked this good or this clear, and there's plenty of headroom here to cope with future PC hardware upgrades. There's a lot of versatility on offer here as well for all types of gaming. Single-player titles look excellent with strong HDR performance on this immersive high-resolution screen. Multiplayer titles look clear at up to 240Hz, with OLED offering a clarity advantage compared to LCDs at the same refresh rate. It's not the best product if you don't want to consume content. There's a risk of burn-in with long periods of static productivity use, but you won't come by many better entertainment monitors than this. I was pleased to see that Gigabyte have tuned this monitor relatively well. The sRGB mode and DisplayPort modes offer excellent accuracy from the factory, and there's a broad range of HDR configurations that go beyond what some of its competitors offer. I wasn't a huge fan of the game HDR mode's tendency to over-increase brightness in some situations, but it's better to have options than not have options, and you could just stick to the usual True Black and Peak 1000 equivalent modes if you want to. These modes have similar calibration to other 4K QD-OLEDs. The primary way Gigabyte have tried to differentiate the FO32U2P from the other models is DisplayPort 2.1. I think this is a nice feature to have and could be more future-proof, but it won't have much of an impact right away, and I'm not convinced it's a feature worth paying a significant premium for. Conversely, Gigabyte do not offer Dolby Vision support, which is found on the Alienware model, and Asus have promised support for it in the future. It's perhaps not a significant feature for gaming, but it is handy for media playback, and if I had to choose one, I think I'd lean more towards wanting Dolby Vision than DisplayPort 2.1. With that said, options are nice, so if you specifically want a DP 2.1, it's great to see Gigabyte providing it and providing it early. As far as pricing and competition goes, the FO32U2P is priced at $1,300 US, making it a premium offering on par with the Asus PG32U CDM. Then there's the AW3225QF at $1,200 US, often the cheapest model in other regions, while the MSI 321URX slots in at $950 US, but more expensive in some regions. Gigabyte are also offering a variant without DP 2.1, the FO32U2, which I would strongly consider at just $1,100 US, though that's based on an assumption that aside from connectivity, it's largely identical to the FO32U2P model that we've just tested. So where does everything slot in? Well, I think most variants have a unique aspect going for them that could sway you one way or another. If you want a curved screen, the Alienware model is the obvious choice. If you want the cheapest model, you're probably choosing either the MSI or Alienware models, and both offer very similar performance. If you want Dolby Vision, the Alienware model now or Asus model in the future will suit you the best. If you want a flat panel, you'd rule out the Alienware. If you want dual mode functionality with 1080p 480Hz for competitive gaming, you'd get an LG OLED monitor. And if you specifically want DisplayPort 2.1 to run without DSC or an extra bright HDR mode, the Gigabyte model is the clear choice. All four offer a similar enough experience that it's hard to point at one and call it the worst performer. Personally, I feel like $1,300 US is too expensive for the FO32U2P considering the rest of the 4K QD-OLED market at the moment, although with these monitors flying off shelves and stock hard to come by, I can hardly blame Gigabyte for choosing a premium price. But yes, in a normal market where everything is available, I don't think the Gigabyte model is worth substantially more than the others. The FO32U2's price, without DisplayPort 2.1, feels much more appropriate to me at $1,100 US, and I just couldn't justify a $200 premium for better connectivity. At the end of the day though, I think the choice is going to largely come down to what specific features you want, and maybe even things like the design in addition to price. It's both a good and bad thing that these monitors all offer similar performance. Great for consumers that you can basically buy any of them and get a great experience, bad that it hasn't created a clear choice. Anyway, that's it for this long review of the Gigabyte Aorus FO32U2P. If you do want to learn more about the DisplayPort 2.1 situation, including more testing and also more thoughts on the cable situation, we do have a couple of dedicated videos right here on Monitors Unboxed where you can get more thoughts on DisplayPort 2.1. Also, if you want to support the channel directly and the testing that we do, please do consider supporting us via Patreon or Floatplane. Links to those are in the description below. Doing so will support our independent testing, and you get some cool benefits and bonuses in return, like our Discord community, which is a great place to chat about monitors. Wow, this has been a long review. Anyway, that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. I'll catch you in the next one.